Thank you very much, Alison, and welcome to all of you. It's an enormous pleasure not only for Central St Martin's, but also for the broader community of University of the Arts London to welcome you all here to this conference, not least because the constituent colleges of University of the Arts London have been incredibly active participants in this debate, really since some of our colleges were formed more than 100 years ago. And every generation, I think, asks questions about the purpose and future of art schools. And probably that question is more actively debated now than it has been for more than 40 years. And it's salutary probably to remember that in the 1960s, when only 4% of school leavers went into higher education, art schools were, generally speaking, small liberal arts and crafts communities with very distinctive personalities, which were really very, very, very different from the small number of much larger universities which at that time comprised the higher education sector. And it's actually exactly 50 years in 1963, when many other things were invented, that the last really major examination of higher education took place. The Robbins Review recommended the major expansion of higher education institutions, which ultimately led to the tenfold increase in the number of students now in higher education. But the massive expansion of opportunities in higher education, however welcome and however socially important, has obviously in itself created its own very particular challenges for art schools. Within 5 years of the Robbins Review, many art schools which had been proudly autonomous for over 50 years found themselves being sucked, at least at first reluctantly, into the newly created polytechnics. And we must remember that those new polytechnics were really designed to combine the art school's broad-based training in liberal arts and crafts with the range of often also small providers of design and technology. And as a result of those changes, many of the great art schools across the country found their very identity and purpose being called into question. And within 5 years, by 1968, the debate around what's the purpose of art school had probably reached its most dramatic ever manifestation in the 6-week student occupation of Hornsey College of Art. And for those of us involved in the stewardship of higher education, that 6-week occupation remains a very salutary reminder of the passions which can be ignited when changes to government policy form the backdrop to a related but really quite different debate around the meaning and importance of an arts institution. But then, just as everything changes, really everything remains the same. Like the student unrest that followed the Brown Review just 3 years ago, the major structural changes in 1960s arts education sparked passionate debates, of which I'm sure we're going to hear more shortly, about the very meaning and purpose of an arts education. Just as they do today, those questions led to debates as to the desirability or otherwise of specialization. They included challenges to the design of the curriculum. And of course, they focused most passionately on students' involvement in the design of what we now describe as the student experience. The question as to how to empower students as co-creators of their own arts education remains just as important now as it did over 40 years ago. And perhaps in a salutary way for all of us, the debate initiated in 1968 had no clear winners. Some art schools like Hornsey were absorbed into the emerging polytechnics. Others, like the proud art and trade schools, which combined to form what's now University of the Arts London, ultimately survived by becoming what's sometimes called a monotechnic. This university became a family of art and design colleges which derived their collective strength from their specialist arts and design focus. But whatever you feel about the way in which those 1960s art schools survived, it would be hard, I think, to argue that they failed to thrive despite shrinking public funding. And it would also be surprising if anyone here would seriously argue against the proposition that the explosion in the number of young people enjoying an arts education at university has massively enriched our society, whatever the effects of that expansion on staff-student ratios and on the resources which we're able to to devote to our students. Now, it's no coincidence, of course, that the explosion in the number of students studying creative subjects at university has been accompanied by the rapid expansion of the UK's creative sector. And although we now live in an age in which creativity is self-evidently valued as a driver of economic success, that very economic success holds, I think, the most insidious dangers for anyone who is trying to answer the question, what's the point of art school? As we all know, in an age of recession and banking collapse, government's allocating its scarce funding by reference to a narrowing range of criteria which focus on what government increasingly describe in the language of instrumentalism as outcomes. And so universities and their leaders, and I find myself doing this, are often forced by political expediency to defend themselves by producing a string of financial data showing how those universities contribute to the economic success of the country. And nothing could have made clearer the particular challenge of this new focus than Marina Miller's, I'm sure, well-intended advice to the arts a few weeks ago in relation to their defence of funding for arts and culture. Marina Miller acknowledged that British culture and creativity are now more in demand than ever before. She urged us to remember that our arts and culture must be defended against Treasury onslaught on the basis of their economic value. Fair enough, you might say, and very sensible. But in her words, she said, after all, the arts and culture are a commodity that other countries value very highly. But here, in the very use of that word commodity, is perhaps our most pressing challenge. So tempted as I am to hang on to the demonstrable economic contribution of the arts in explaining the purpose of art school, I nevertheless hope that in addressing the topic of this conference, we remain at very times very wary of the subtle dangers of relying too heavily on the economic value of our graduate skills. Because for me, a creative education must ultimately be more important than economic outcomes. Because the creativity that drives our art schools is the single most important factor that allows us to imagine, to discover, to invent, and ultimately to improve our world. For me, the overriding point of art schools is to enable our students to discover and celebrate their own creativity. Without that creativity, we are all less. Without it, we're less inspired and we're less inventive. Without it, we're less resourceful and actually, most important, we're less fulfilled. Without it, we're less socially aware, we're less globally aware, and we're ultimately less of a society. Without creativity, in fact, we're ultimately less human. And in that, for me, lies the key to the answer to the question, what's the point of art school? So I look forward to the debate. Thank you. So it now gives me great pleasure to welcome our opening speaker, Kim Howells. Kim was born and raised in Aberdare, South Wales. He entered Hornsey College of Art in 1965. He studied fine art and ultimately he practiced revolution, leading the 6-week occupation of the art school during the summer of 1968. Fresh from his experience as a passionate debater of the importance of art school whilst at Hornsey, Kim turned his attentions to coal mining and rugby before reading English and history at Cambridge College of Arts and Technology. Later, in the early 1980s, Kim worked for the South Wales miners. He was their spokesman. He was a picket organiser throughout the miners' strike of 1984-85, and he was then elected MP for Pontypridd in 1989. Kim later held ministerial posts for the Labour government in the Departments of Education, Trade and Industry, Culture, Media and Sport, and the Foreign Office. And then somewhat intriguingly, as a footnote in his biography, given his earlier career at Hornsey, and perhaps proving the proposition that art school can take you into the most unexpected directions, Kim chaired the government's Intelligence and Security Committee, overseeing MI5, MI6, and GCHQ. So you can do anything after studying art. And now, as well as presenting the BBC TV series Framing Wales, which explores the history of art in Wales, Kim continues to paint. He's currently toiling away at his eagerly anticipated novel, which is, as he describes it himself, a boy's own adventure. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Kim Howells.